Hi, I'm Charles Alexander, and I'm just really thrilled to have these two fine gentlemen here. But obviously, the big news is Glenn's departure from Spotify, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But I kind of want to let you guys introduce yourselves just a tiny bit and kind of go from there. John, JB, you want to start?
Sure, I'm John Butler. I'm a friend of Charles Alexander's. I'll admit that to the ends of the earth and for all time.
You're
Um,
very kind.
I served as a lead editor, genre editor, as part of the global editorial team at Spotify from 2017 through 2019. And prior to that, I ran uh, promotion at a number of different labels, both in New York and Nashville. And currently, I am a COO for hire and consult a number of startup labels and am deep into data analyzation and catalog management and the like. And Glenn is a hero of mine, so I'm really happy to ask him lots of questions. And he was very helpful during my time at Spotify too. So I'm hoping that we'll talk a little. Maybe he doesn't even know that, but hopefully we'll be able to talk about that too.
Yeah. Glenn?
Hi, I'm Glenn McDonald, and up until recently, I was data alchemist at Spotify for a long time and at the Echo Nest before that. And I did a lot of things and tried to make the world better for music in whatever ways I could.
Uh, I'm Charles Alexander. I'm here in Nashville, Tennessee. We have a label services company called Launcher, and then I also have an artist management and marketing company called Outside the Box Music. And to echo John's sentiments, Glenn's a big hero of mine, even back when 2 companies ago. And I think it's safe to say without Glenn and his team's work, uh, I wouldn't have this career as suspect as it is. But I kind of want to read a couple of things before we proceed. Um, and obviously, your departure from Spotify has reverberated all through our community. And there have been a couple of things that I think, sort of try to touch on what the moment means. And just going to review some of that. Um, Every Noise at Once, which is your project, everynoise.com. Every Noise at Once is like a treasure map for music lovers. Its genre map lets users dive deep into the world of sounds and thousands of genres, literally discovering new genres and hidden gems along the way. But now, with Glenn no longer at Spotify, the data flow has dried up, putting the site's future in jeopardy. And then at the end of this article on Kill the DJ, there's a quote from an anonymous fan who says, the quote, "I'm not an unmitigated fan of many things in this world, but Every Noise was without qualification my favorite website ever. I don't know. This week's Spotify layoff will be remembered as one of the worst business decisions ever, but I will remember it that way." And that's on Kill the DJ. And this is right off Glenn's own website, furia.com. And I kind of was reading this last night, and I think the first 2 paragraphs are worth quoting and repeating. "I did my job with love and belief. This was obviously risky. I had no illusions that the love was returned, or that it is even possible for a public corporation of non trivial scale to behave in human ways at all. It's easy to find cogent advice for how to modulate your emotional attachment to your job so that losing it is not like losing a part of yourself. I cheerfully recommend ignoring this. The world is better if everybody does their jobs with love and commitment. You definitely want everybody who does a job that affects you to do it with love, so lead by example. This method will result in sporadic stabs of excruciating pain, but the parts of you lose to jobs regrow quickly. even if you sometimes have to rub some numbing ointment on the wounds for a while. And there it is. So we have so many questions, but my first question is, what the hell happened?
I'm in no position to say. I mean, corporate layoffs are necessary for corporate reasons, and as a participant in them, you don't get explanations.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. Did you kind of see it coming, or was that part of the
no,
conversations?
no, no.
Yeah.
It was 9:15 on Monday morning.
Yeah.
But I've had other jobs. This Spotify was my sixth corporate acquisition, and I've started at small companies and seen them grow big and get acquired by bigger ones. And I've been through layoffs multiple times, sometimes surviving them, sometimes not. At least once I wanted to be laid off and didn't. So it it works both ways. I mean, I believe what I said in that like you should do your job with as much personal investment as possible, even if these things are painful when they end, because that's how the world gets better.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen. Well, speaking for myself, and I think for huge numbers of folks in the community, um, for me at least, the algorithmic stuff and every noise, I think before we jumped on, I was saying I'm trained as a molecular biologist. Um, everynoise.com was definitely the ultimate phylogenetic tree in terms of trying to connect things to things musically. Um, and it was amazing, at least for me, how well, it wasn't one dimensional. Everything is connected, and on that site you saw how everything was connected, certainly on the musical front, but you also got to see how culture is connected, and so that was what I think drew me to Every Noise at when I first discovered it, and then ever since. And it was that all part of the thought process, or did it sort of organically evolve that way? I mean, so how did Every Noise come about, and how did sort of that learning piece? Because one of the things that I also want to get into is that all the stuff that you're doing is self-taught, correct? Like, you didn't go to school for this stuff, as far as I
It's
understand it.
true. I my college degree is in filmmaking and photography.
So
I
obvious, yeah.
I did not. There were no courses in music data analysis
Hmm.
for the graduating class of 1989. There was barely any music data to even exist. My
Sure.
record collection spreadsheet was big data in 1989. So the Every Noise began at the Echo Nest long before we were acquired by Spotify as part of a debugging tool. Because one of the things we did at the Echo Nest was do these machine learning exercises to try to model human psychoacoustic, like emotional reactions to music, like get the computers to help us quantify things about how we listen. So like the emotional valence of a song and its danceability, and so I think it was when we were doing instrumentalness, we were trying to train machine learning to be able to guess whether a song has vocals or not, because it's useful to know when it's an instrumental versus vocal. And with all these things, we'd do a lot of examples, and we had a corner of the room filled with college interns, and we'd have them feed them a bunch of examples, and they'd go through and say, oh, this is instrumental, this one's not, this one is, this one's not. And then we'd run these things, and you could pick individual songs to, after the process scored them and try to see whether it was working. But it's really hard to evaluate how good the model was, because you can't have the interns check every all 60 million songs. Otherwise, you would have had them tag the songs themselves to begin with and save the computing resources. So I spent a lot of time like trying to figure out how to assess how we were doing, and aggregating those scores by genre at least gave us some sanity checking. So, if you rank the genres by aggregate instrumentalness, then you better see like classical piano high on instrumentalness, and like your a cappella groups better be low on instrumentalness. And if they're not, then you're like not done yet. So that began as a scatter plot of genres, like comparing two of those, like instrumentalness versus acousticness. So you could see the acoustic instrumental things and the electric things with vocals and stuff. And as a scatter plot, the names were there's just big piles of names. Like most of the page was unreadable. So I spent a while writing little fiddly computer code to bump the names around and try to make it readable without moving them any further from their like proper origin on the graph as possible. And that was useful for debugging, but the more I used it for debugging, I was like, this is kind of an interesting way to look at the universe of genres. And the universe at that point was like 400 or something, because the genre project was the underlying project that makes all those genres also began earlier than that, the Echo Nest, and has continued and hopefully will continue at Spotify. I mean, I wasn't the only one who worked on categorizing things, and so my wish is that they keep doing it. But it began small, and at the point where there were 500 genres, I guessed, maybe there are 1,000. And when we got to 1,000, I'm like, could there be 2,000? And after about 1,500, I'm just like, forget it. I'm not gonna try to guess anymore. It's sort of, people make more of them, and the past is full of them that we haven't discovered yet. And it was just see where the Odyssey leads.
Yeah. Well, what's really cool about it is that, there's so many things that are cool about it, but one of the things is that as a creative, even if as a musician, if you're creating all these things, you know the arc of musical evolution had you end up making things that you don't realize are new things. And when you do create those new things and it goes out into the world and it's a release, and it gets folded into every noise, for me, it's mind-blowing how you can sort of trace the evolution of that piece of music or that genre, even if the person who created it doesn't realize that, right? So it's a roadmap to their influences, which again is an amazing. It's an 200 years from now, it'd be like an anthropological tool, right? So you can sort of like go through your stuff, and you can kind of go, oh, that's how this is related, and this is related. And for someone who believes that ultimately, even if you want to talk about country music here in Nashville and sort of how people claim that as a territorial or a parochial thing now, I think eventually we will find that it's all interconnected, even if it's other genres that are sort of similarly related. But like one of the things that comes up in conversation all the time is, and I don't know if every noise is going to organically address this or if it's going to show up as such. But, one of the things when people talk about how, we keep people of color out of country music, and, like people like, gosh, what's her name? The one who plays the banjo says, it was derived from a West African instrument. And so, we co-opted the instrument, brought it into the genre. And so it'd be interesting to see at some point, if you have that anthropological interest, if that you can actually track that and kind of draw the lines and make the connections.
Yeah, I mean, I think of myself as like a person who knows some things about music, but the genre project is just basically stomped on my ego. It's like, all right, you don't. The world is so much bigger than you realize. Like
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
and so just the constant discovery. Everywhere you look in the world, there's music, and it has a rich history, and the number of things that millions and millions of people know and listen to every day, and I had no idea about, even as a supposed music nerd, was like astonishing to me.
Yeah. Yeah. John, how did you, when you were an editor at Spotify and even now, use Every Noise and some of the work? I know how I use it, but I'm going to defer that to like later in the conversation.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we'll talk about that because I don't have a perspective of using it before I got to Spotify. It actually, I actually didn't know much about it until Athena Kumis,
Yeah.
who was in the programming
Shout out to
team.
Athena. Yeah.
Yep, of course. Actually was very good at keeping me on time, by the way. So X at a certain point was running the North American team and sort of, and at the time that I joined Spotify, it was kind of run like a TV station, like you were programming to certain parts of the day, or he worked on a master schedule of, this is the stuff that happens in the morning, this is stuff that happens midday. There was like a how you set up things, and certainly. And I'm sorry to give you a background, but I wanted to set this up so
No. I
that
think that's just important. Yeah.
yeah, just to kind of to ask better questions of Glenn. So as far as I knew, X kind of ran the way that the search or home sort of looked, and we all had the ability to speak into when we wanted our particular genre playlists or things to show up at particular times of the day and particular days of the week. So Athena sort of moved into that role as X sort of moved on into different parts of the company, still in editorial. But Athena was working on early versions of Fresh Finds. In fact, I think she started it. I could be wrong. It might have been crowdsourced by a number of other editors, but to my knowledge, the first time I had ever really heard about Fresh Finds was Athena, and she was just scouring. But she was scouring things that already had come out. And I realized very quickly, like, oh, yeah, that's right. There was music that came out prior to the week that I'm working in. It only took me about 3 weeks to kind of lose a sense of future and past because there was so much to deal with in the week that you were in. And I was really tired of the program Scatman, which was the Spotify catalog manager. You can search for anything that would happen to be uploaded into the back end of Spotify at any given time, utilizing Scatman. And it was, accurate. It had tags associated with it. It told you when it was coming out. And that's how I'd search for music that either wasn't being presented to me externally, right? By the way, I'm kind of giving you the life of Spotify prior to Spotify for Artists existing. Right. So it's really important from a technical standpoint and from a management of platforms inside the platform standpoint. It kind of was really messy. I was still working off of spreadsheets. Most of the editorial team were working off of spreadsheets that we shared interdepartmentally. Actually, Athena and X at one point were sort of running and overseeing all of the songs that were being considered for editorial playlisting for any given week were being presented to us by all different teams within inside editorial, programming, artist relations, publishing relations, all that. So you get this master spreadsheet of songs that were being pitched for that week. And, you'd have to assign, your level of, first of all, awareness that they were even out. Because again, it was very easy to get siloed for whatever reason. But Athena and John Stein, who I also want to give a shout out to, were
John,
very helpful. Yeah. So John was very helpful to me. I had a lot to learn, right? I was a playlister, but it's a different thing when you're working for Spotify in terms of understanding where you're grabbing and from and why you were working with it. So I want to get to kind of how I discovered.
So John, for context, I just want people
yeah.
to know that you came from radio. right?
Yeah, well, it came
Radio
from
promotion.
radio promotion. So I was
Yeah,
definitely, but I was a radio promo guy that was really concerned with radio research,
yeah,
because I was living and dying of whether or not my songs were going to do well based on a very small group of people that listened to the radio that either wrote in surveys whether or not they liked it, and were involved in call out research. And I'm even talking all the way to 2016, 2017, right? So
yeah,
it's still
yeah.
very much the way that measurement tools were. I didn't have any illusions as to what I was walking into when I got to Spotify, but the measurement and the granularity of what was going on was far beyond my capability mentally to understand how I could utilize it and get my hands around it, because it was kind of, and Glenn, all apologies, but the way the way that you describe it, it really means a lot, because you were kind of like giving words to things that I'd only felt in music, right? So like when I was at Spotify, all the reason why I was at Spot, there was absolutely a reason that I guess I was talented enough to be there, and they wanted me to be there, and my ear heard things a different way. But here, when I discovered everynoise.com, or actually parts of it, because it looked a little bit different internally, you could access it. I'm not even sure how I accessed it, but Athena came over and said, "Hey, you should use this thing." Glenn finds a lot of things that are not being serviced to us or not being shown to us, right? And that was true. In fact, I remember, and this is not within the first 6 weeks of me being there. I don't think I even learned that it existed until months after I was there. I think it was a conversation with Athena about, where are you finding this stuff for Fresh Finds? Because it's not in my queue. It's not in my spreadsheets.
Right, right.
The available stuff that I was looking for was under particular sorts of genres and subgenres. And it seemed like we were missing a lot of things. And then lo and behold, I get into everynoise.com and I see there's like 200 releases out of Foro or Brazilian gospel. Now, back up a second. My role coming into Spotify was head of Christian music, right? From Spotify's perspective, Christian music meant the music that was being made from Nashville, out of this community here. Where when I went to everynoise.com, I recognized very quickly, along with Rocio Guerrero, who was head of Latin at the time, and she was talking about diasporas. You got to understand the diasporas, right? Every noise. I'm sorry, she's a very
Right.
passionate person.
No.
Very
Well, note
easy
to self, I need to get
imitate.
Athena and her on the show.
Oh no, she's great. It's over at Amazon. And she was like, "John, you don't understand. It's like, it's music over here that resonates over here, and like, but there's no roadmap to that. It was just more of a feeling." And that gave the individual editors that knew particular musics a lot of visibility and credence. Like, they kind of knew the sounds that would resonate in Africa could resonate in Chile, or or reggaeton could have a relationship to Afro beats, right? But here it was in everynoise.com, kind of the rock and roll family tree, all like in code, and way too much for me to kind of get my hands around. So I don't mean to like name drop, and I'm not really trying to do that, but it's like particular people sort of put it together for me. And another one was Romeo Tacchio, and I can't remember his last name, but he was in data science. Yes, that's right. And he showed something in just certain genres that we were over programming versus what the audience wanted. And it was a scatter plot, right? And I'm like, I've seen this before. Athena, what's that thing that we use, right? We use. I'm not aware, Glenn, and that was kind of my first question. Were you aware of how little or often the editorial team was accessing Every Noise for their work? I found it indispensable at a particular time to find Brazilian gospel or Lovasong, or like there was all these sort of like Christian music that was being made in Norway had a name tag for it, you know, that I would not have been serviced it. I would not have been shown it because there wasn't necessarily an artist rep or a label team rep to sort of send it to me, or I just didn't have awareness of it. Or so in a sense, I discovered so many different genres or micro genres of genres. And Every Noise became a place for me to go to while I was considering building out playlist ecosystems to address content gaps that we had. So that is the way that I used it initially, internally, as an additional way for me to surface music that may not have been surfaced. And unfortunately, to my knowledge, it didn't update at 12 midnight on Friday. So I was doing a lot of this work at 8 or 9 in the morning the following day, and it refreshed, and I'm like, oh my gosh. By that time, I had already made New Music Friday Christian, or had updated a number of different like playlists. So, and by the way, still by hand. We hadn't, to my knowledge, was not taught that we had a way to do this, not manually, but we were still manually adding things and refreshing lists. So I was discovering a lot of things like, man, I missed that. How did I miss that? Or there was a number of major label releases that may not have been in the right sort of category or genre category that everynoise.com did not see. So one of my biggest questions is that, because I found the Spotify new releases section in the more. So I didn't spend a lot of time on everynoise.com in the main things. I went to the part of the site that said more, and you pulled down and it said Spotify new releases. And I was just gobsmacked about the idea, like, of how many more songs there were that were coming out any particular given week in any different genre. And some things that were being missed even completely within sort of the code of Christian music, or just any pop or anything like that. You know, the ability to go and have the rabbit hole journey down in that section for new releases was fantastic. And I was able to catch things and discover things that were not ever going to be surfaced to me, either internally, or I did not have any sort of tangible way to discover it. So I can tell you that from then. Again, I have to tell you, I don't, I reported into Mike Begain for some time, and Mike and I talked briefly about Every Noise, but generally speaking, I'm not really aware how often I had discussions internally when I was an editor with other editors on how they used it, or if they were even aware of it. So that was my first question for you. And if you are able to elaborate, is that how much awareness did you have on the tool actually being utilized by the internal editorial team?
Well, it's a big company, so I would not necessarily hear about things when people started doing them. But if anything broke, then suddenly I would discover who was using it. So the new release thing, I mean, I'm like a new music fanatic. I sort of listen constantly forward from my own reasons. So that was always one of my favorite parts of of my efforts. And new releases is funny because there's nothing secret about it. Like there's no, it's in Spotify, it's in everybody's interest, Spotify's, artists, everybody else, for new releases to be discoverable by the right people who want to hear them. But it's a giant nightmare making that happen with the way the data is normally organized. And so I think I was on a discussion board where there was a thread called New Releases on Spotify, and people would just post the stuff they were interested in that week. And me I'd been on that music forum before the Alchemist, before Spotify. But when we got acquired, I was like, I could probably help this. Like I can make a longer list. I can use the data to produce the list instead of just relying on somebody happened to notice that this that this album came out. So yeah, the initial version of that, which was called the Sorting Hat at the time, because there hadn't been
That's
any
right.
Yeah, that's right.
rattling
There
backlash yet.
wasn't an acronym though. We had Scatman, which I, later figured out meant Spotify Catalog Manager. That made a lot of sense to me. Sorting Hat is actually what Athena called it. It wasn't called Every Noise at once internally. It was called Sorting Hat.
Yeah, that was that one page, and initially it was a single page. It had two columns. The right column was literally all the new releases that came out that week, which when at the time I started doing it was like 3,000 releases a week. And then on the left side, I had some code that tried to organize them by genre. And like you say, the genre stuff is always partial. I mean, the goal of the genres on Every Noise was to give you some sense of the most representative artists for each genre, which is never, I mean, so there were 250 hip hop artists, and of course there are, 75 million rappers now, or whatever the current count is. And it would never be meaningful to put them all on a page. And so it's true that things were missing, even famous artists who were very famous, but maybe not super core to whatever slice you were looking at might not be there. And that part evolved over time, and eventually the list got unwieldy, and I eventually replaced it with a new version that didn't try to just make it all one page and would slice things up. And I did eventually make the internal version would update on Tuesdays in advance of Fridays, and then it would be published in public on Friday.
Right.
So that was eventually more helpful to the editors. But yeah, I mean, I was sort of isolated from the the label and artist relations side. So I was always just trying to find what was happening in music, and it wasn't limited by what we happened to be making playlists about. So I wasn't seeking out Brazilian gospel for your sake, although if you'd asked me to, I would have tried to. But that phrase of like Glenn finds things that other people don't find is of course not really what's happening at all. Like I don't know anything about those really, and I'm not finding things. It's the world that's doing it. Like everybody's collective listening is where all this intelligence comes from, and my only mission was to try to help it self-organize to be able to find what are the new releases that the fans of Brazilian gospel know about, or from artists that the fans of Brazilian gospel know about. Because if it relied on me, I mean, that was the interesting thing about Fresh Finds for me. It was very human intensive. Like it relied on a few people. It only did a few things. There were like 5 different Fresh Finds lists, so it had very specific targets of kinds of things. So like, I'm a metal fan personally. As a listener, there was no Fresh Finds metal. And when I suggested it, it was dismissed because it was not the vibe. Fresh Finds was not a thing designed to. There weren't going to be 6,000 Fresh Finds. There were 5, and they were carefully picked. And Athena and the other people who worked on that were very, very good at that, and they were really in charge of personally listening to things and hearing stuff. And I do that too in my own life, but that was not my job. My job was like do math, organize what the world knows, and try to feed it back to us, the world, but also editors, and find stuff. And I think that I'm an atheist, and I want Christian editors to be able to find Christian music, and I hate jazz, and I want jazz fans to find jazz. It's like it's not
You're
my
a
own
true
moral
agnostic.
agenda.
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't just. Oh, I wanted to let you know. I did not realize that when I left Spotify, that was the only time that was the first time that I realized that Every Noise wasn't updated in the same way publicly than it was for Sorting Hat throughout the week on Tuesday. Like I guess I actually didn't realize that I wasn't using a different thing. I thought actually like, oh, I can start planning ahead what I'm going to do on Friday now. And no, the public version of that was updated only on Friday, and Sorting Hat was for those releases for that week. But
It was the
as
same.
soon as
It was the same thing.
it was the same
It
thing.
moved to one server on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday, and then starting at midnight on Friday, that it was allowed to go public.
Yeah, there were some things I remember there could be. I don't know if there was some sort of mechanism that labels or somebody could keep a record out of Sorting Hat. I do remember there being I remember some sort of question that I had, like, wow, that didn't sort, that never showed up in Sorting Hat all through the whole entire week, yet it's out on Friday. What happened? Like, how did it miss it? Because we had, and I guess it kind of speaks to another question I had. You were doing this and working this through as part of the Echonesis work, and it became part of what I always considered to be the sort of Dead Sea Scrolls of Spotify. It's like the true gospel, and I can only relate it to that because it's always top of mind, right? But finding the root causes. Let me back up a second. I had to ask you about this, and it's one of those questions that I have, like, because I'm used to dealing and working with your work to make other things with it, and it's gratifying for me to be able to tell you how appreciative that your work created other things, right? Maybe even things that were made that you weren't even aware of, or inspired other things that weren't necessarily, oh yeah, they're going to utilize this for that. I mean, I don't know if you've thought about that, but certainly, I was always curious as a promotion person and working on the label side prior to being at Spotify. The reasons why fans also was the way that it was, right? And like, because a number of our artists on the labels and other labels would say, I don't have anything to do with those artists. Like, why am I associated with those artists? And come to find, at one of my goals when I joined Spotify was to figure out the secret sauce of how fans also worked. You know what I found out? I never solved that question. And because it still was there were enough questions that enough artists, now that I'm on the receiving end of their wrath as to why they're being associated with artists that have still have no answer, still zero answer, other than the fact that it looks like things have not been updated. And I don't know if that fell under the areas of work that you were working on, because I know you weren't the only person there, but how much of what you did was being mirrored or created into something that Spotify would continue to use. In other words, when I was saying that I was able to create things based on the stuff that you provided in Sorting Hat, everynoise.com, post Spotify for me, were you aware of what parts of the stuff that you were working on were being used by the programming team to create other things that are existing now? And are you able to share any things that started with what you were working on that now is a part of sort of the everyday language on the platform?
And
Sure.
besides
Fresh Finds, which is tangible.
And for context, at that time, around that time period, how many releases a day or week were you?
That's a really good question.
Yes, it was like 3,000 releases a week when I
right.
started putting them on a page. And when it got to about 20,000 a week, the page just took too long to build. So at that point, I started putting a threshold. So if you were an artist who had never been played before, like if you had 0 streams, and then I would just not show the release, and that cut it to like 10,000. But by the time I left, it was more like 100,000, and I had gradually raised the thresholds for even what was included in that 100,000. So I worked on lots and lots of stuff. The stuff you see on Every Noise is like it's like a tiny surface layer, the tip of a large iceberg. So the genre project was not,
Yeah.
I mean, was a thing, and it still is a thing. And the visualization of it on a map was what I did in Every Noise. But my day job was managing that system, and a lot of other people participated in defining genres and helping to make it make sense. And over time, I iterated on the code of it many times to try to make it better and to not miss things and to find pieces of the world that we hadn't categorized and build tools to help us categorize them. But Fans Also Like is totally part of this story, because we thought about genres as communities of artists, of listeners, of practice. Most of the time, a genre is a combination of those things. There's some stylistic elements to it. There's an audience. There's a group of artists. Sometimes it's more listener driven, more artist driven, more like classical viola is a genre. The artists may not know each other. There are probably not that a lot of listeners who just listen to classical viola, but it's still a thing. But the way all those genres work, and I've explained this in many forums before, there's nothing secret about this, is people at Spotify decide this is a genre, we're going to include it, this is what we're going to call it, and then namespace so that all the names are unique. And here's some artists who define what we mean by that. And given 40 artists that are what we mean by classic rock, for example, then you can extrapolate from the shared listeners of those artists to the other artists that sort of belong to that same audience and say, oh, if those are what you mean by classic rock, those 40, these other 173 belong to that same circle, whatever it is you're calling it. And it's like the computer code doesn't care what the name is, it's just a cluster. And Fans Also Like, which has gone through a bunch of interesting evolutions over time, was the mechanism for doing that. And that was a thing that we began at the Echo Nest too. Like, one of the things that we did was try to do this, what we called similar artists, because at the Echo Nest, we didn't have firsthand fan data. It was all secondhand from our partners and catalogs and other sources of whatever. And the great, there were many interesting things for me in joining Spotify, but the big jump in my ability to figure things out was we actually had, actually look at individual listeners' data and correlate patterns. So I think it was called Related Artists originally, and when the name changed to Fans Also Like, that was great to me, because that's the premise. It's because related, you're like, what does related mean? Are they friends? Do they know each other? Is it making a statement about the stylistic similarity or the historical provenance or whatever? And Fans Also Like was, no, this is a clear statement of purpose. The fans of this artist like these other artists.
Right.
And there's the math for doing that is not, has variables. And so there's human decisions that go into what those algorithms do. But the idea is that it's not editorializing. It's not expressing an opinion. It's not expressing the artist's endorsement of those other artists. It really is trying to reflect what is different about this fan base versus this other fan base. Only recently has that been literally true. For a long time, it was a combination of shared fans, and, because this is one of the things we did at the Echo Nest, shared descriptive terminology scraped off the web, which at the Echo Nest was all we had. Like, we scraped every page about music that we could find on the web and tried to figure out what vocabulary people used. And so if this band gets described as progressive metal and this other band gets described as progressive metal, and the banjo is never used for either of them, and you keep going like that, and you have a lot of words and in this massive glossary, and then you can start saying patterns and say, well, the ways in which this band is described are the same as the ways this band is described. So for years, we combined those two signals. Now, the problem with that is if you're a very famous band with a very unique name, then it's very easy to identify that a web page with your name on it is actually about you. Like if you're Imagine Dragons or Weezer, then those phrases don't come up very often outside of the context of those bands, and you can use techniques like looking for mentions of songs that you or album titles that you know belong to that band to be sure. If you're an unknown artist whose name is picked inadvisably for the modern era, like government, then most of the web pages that say government on them, even on sites that are nominally music blog sites, are probably not about you. And it was very hard to find stuff about an unknown artist named Government and not get it confused. And over time, I basically gradually made the case that we now had enough listening data and good enough math to really let that feature be exactly what it said. Fans also like. And so
Yeah.
as of my departure, and hopefully it'll keep running without me there, it is that.
Yeah, the somewhere in between those two things where you were talking about how terms that are outside of the internet that you were scraping from and places, there was some chatter, I remember, at Spotify that if you want to be an artist that does well on Spotify, you need to really talk negatively about Spotify on Twitter.
That
Like
was never
more
part of it.
No,
That
right.
was totally a myth. There was no.
Right. Well, that's what I mean.
None of that at all.
This is a great opportunity to talk about like myths. Because it's helpful. I mean, people have definitely made significant decisions based on myths when they've worked, in this sense of like, how do we work with this? Not really having all the data that you could possibly want without a lot of transparency to actually how to connect the dots back to the audience, the person that streamed them, right? So there's a lot of assumptions that are made externally. There are a lot of assumptions that I made as an editor where all this stuff came from, right? And whether or not it was even really part of my job to really care whether or not those were helpful to an artist. Glenn, I don't know if one of the things sorry, we're getting in the weeds, Charles, here, but one of the things I always
cool with me.
Well, the amount of data that we had that I felt like was actually helpful to how an artist should go about how they organized their career or what they needed to do or how they released was incredible. The willingness to listen to somebody that was at Spotify that wasn't in marketing at a label, that I was going to be in a situation to tell them how to do their job, that level of a willingness was very low. But there was a lot of learnings about how things began and started and became successful on Spotify and certainly on other DSPs and other markets that we were kind of sitting on. And that sort of, but there wasn't really a Sherpa that could actually kind of take you through like, well, that's connected to this and that's connected to this. So there were certain things that even post Spotify, being in there and kind of just learning and I assumed and brought with me a lot of myths externally after leaving that I probably have propagated, but certainly that there's other things that I know are certainly true that relied on a deeper understanding of the data of how we were working. You could see it was kind of like, you'd always wonder like, well, how did that happen? How did that artist become who they were? Well, at Spotify, I had lots of things that could tell me, well, it could have been these 10 different things that they did at particular times that could never be replicated again because the world doesn't work like that because it's all based on somebody that pressed a button and decided to listen to. So it was like learning all of everything for no reason for it to ever be applied ever again to another artist. So there was a lot of that, a lot of like, man, the worst case of I don't know, just just too much to think about. I wanted to give you a sort of an example of how I had to kind of deal with the data or certain the stuff that you guys were working on that was related to Fans Also Like in this transition, and then I'll end it. But I wanted to kind of give you sort of a case scenario that I did. Charles, you might know the story. There was an artist that I was working with, not working with, but I really liked, that I actually discovered prior to their music being on Spotify. And I caught it I think I caught it in Sorting Hat, like in time. I'm like, wow, this is fantastic. So I reached out, but this artist had no sort of game, probably wasn't going to be like, they were coming from a Christian music background, but they had no interest in having their music being programmed in my playlists that were Christian, because they didn't want to reach that community. They had a very different mindset. They didn't want to be boxed in by a genre. And I found this to be a very, very difficult thing internally at Spotify, to where if it didn't have a genre that, and this is a while ago now, this is not recent. So I went to Begain and I said, I want to try something. And luckily for me, I had the ability to put a record in New Music Friday. I had actually 5 songs that I could decide in New Music Friday US to put in. Yeah. And I said, you know what? We're going to try something here. If I put it in a Christian playlist, they're only going to be heard by Christian users, because that's a Christian playlist and that's how they would get it heard. But they don't want to be shown to that audience. How am I going to convince everybody that this is not that genre and kind of play it? Well, if I put it in New Music Friday as one of my picks, no one's going to say anything, because I have one of the picks. But they did not have an audience profile. So I said to the artist, do not tell anybody that listens to Christian music that's in your fan base to listen to the music that they listen to. Do not tell your family. Do not tell anybody that you know that has any sort of business workings with you that listens to Christian music to do anything on Spotify. I need a pure sample. I need to figure out whether or not you could, to prove a case here. And I didn't tell anybody about this other than Mike. So the record came out on Friday, and you didn't have immediate data as to you weren't getting populated by all Fans Also Like artists immediately. It took a second. I don't remember how long it took. But after about a week, I started to see the data, and they had artists that weren't part of the Christian ecosystem, that there was actually listening from lots of different people. And then after a certain amount of time, all of a sudden the data started changing. More people began to be aware of this artist's, heritage, where they came from. More people in their circle started streaming them. And I could see in sort of not real time, but certainly daily, that, these artists that they're for, that either sound like or similar artists at the time, that's what it was called, their Fans Also Like, was changing. And about a month after that release being out, all the hubbub had gone away, and pretty much looked like Fans Also Like was doing their job, which was essentially finding this music for people that listen to other music that was in that particular genre. And one of the challenges, I thought, for me and for artists that could live outside of other genres, whether or not they were associated with, is that the Fans Also Like was kind of reflecting back not the cage, but the box that we were in already. Mm-hmm. And then that if it's going to be based on just behavior alone, and they couldn't get out of that group of people, then, how could you have breakthroughs? I mean, how could you have music that resonated in other parts of the world, if you never visited that part of the world, you didn't have fans there. So I wondered if I don't even know if that experiment really kind of did anything helpful for me, other than to create more problems. But it was
so many experiments.
I know. And I have to tell you, like, I kind of felt like you and your team were the place that a lot of these things probably could get dreamt up. I wasn't a part of that team. I was like, I had only a certain amount of time and runway to be able to try these different things. That wasn't necessarily one of my things. It was like, that was a bigger question. If I have any regrets, and I don't, but they're just maybe
But
I don't.
if I
actually.
were, here they are.
If I had regret, is that I actually didn't share more of these internally, and have these more discussions beyond just the editorial team, because this just seemed like a waste of time to them.
Yeah, that would have been an opportunity, right? I mean,
Right.
I could talk about this all day, but I know you guys have a limited amount of time, so I'm gonna be that guy and ask some of the questions I get asked on a daily basis, if not hourly. And part of the reason why I've paid a lot of attention to your work, Glenn, and also to yours, John, is that for me, from the outside looking in, it seemed like a lot of decisions were arbitrary, right? In terms of what gets featured, what doesn't. And so looking at the data, I could at least hang my hat on something. And I monitored a lot of the list that you have. And so those became sort of my Rosetta Stone. And then I would try to, because I'm a data mining guy from a previous life. And so try to data mine or try to sort of cluster things into. So if a particular new artist came and they had a specific kind of music, then trying to, beyond just my gut kind of going, oh, this will work, this won't work, is to then try to best fit it against a particular genre, related genres or related artists and all that stuff, and try to see if all that stuff would fit and if us taking on the project would even make sense. And then once the music was out, try to figure out, what worked and what didn't work, both in terms of strategy and marketing on the ground, and as well as how that music fit or didn't fit or resonated inside an entire cluster of music. And so, again, going to be that guy and ask, outside of the editorial influences and outside of playlists, which, most of us know is just such a tiny fraction of what the ecosystem is supposed to do. What can a new artist or a mid-level artist do within the context of understanding where they fit in the data, or in how curation, both in a manual human form happens and algorithmically happens? What gives you sort of the best chance at discovery based on the systems that exist from a data perspective?
And I'm sure you'll be unsurprised to learn that people have asked me this question regularly for at least the last 10 years, if not 12.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And the good news, I guess, from my point of view, is that my answer doesn't change at all having left Spotify, because the answer is basically has nothing to do with Spotify. Like the ways in which you make a career in music mostly haven't changed. Like they are mostly based on finding a community, and that community can be online, it can be in Discord, it can be scattered. It doesn't have to be, based around a bar in your hometown anymore, like it once maybe had to. But finding a community and helping it build and being part of how it builds. And I think people always want there to be some shortcut. There's like what's the
Magic
right
bullet,
length,
yeah.
and should I put how do I title it, and what's the right term in terms to use in my submission to the editors, and like all that maybe it might matter on an individual case, but it's like most advice books, 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. It's not, those are not 7 things that are going to make you successful. It's like we found some people who are already successful and we asked them what they did. And there may be some commonality to that, but those same habits are also the habits of unsuccessful people. Like there's not a cause and effect relationship. And even before Spotify at the Alchemist, people would ask us to predict hits, and I would always say, I don't do prediction. I can draw a graph, but if it gets to here, I have no idea whether that's how high it's going to go or it's going to go up. I
Right.
don't pretend, and I think anybody who pretends that ought to just go into the stock market and do their betting there. I don't think it's interesting for culture. It's interesting what people actually do, and it's interesting how we make decisions that move into the future. But predicting the future as if it's independent from our actions is not interesting to me. So I think it's all the things that that you have to do as an artist. You make friends, you go on tours with people, you collaborate, you produce each other's records, you take advantage of each other's successes to lift each other up. And that's how it always works. And the technology companies would like it to be different than that because they would like to have more control. And they do in a sort of lottery way. So, if your song gets on gets put in Discover Weekly for 1 million people, then suddenly you'll have a lot of streams, but there's nothing you could have done to make that happen. There's no people making that decision. It's math, and there's rounding error, and it's basically a lottery.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of what I think the industry needs is ways that aren't lotteries. Like, how do you make a career? Tell me. And I mean, I do make music. It's not my career. My lifetime earnings are slightly over $4. And I'm not trying to get any bigger than that.
Maybe it'll get
fine
redistributed to a more higher performing artist, but go ahead.
Yeah, right. I will no longer get paid after the upcoming changes. And that's fine. That's fine. I don't need that money. That's not the point. But there's not yet a good story about how do I make a living as a musician and work up in the same way that there's a story about how do I make a living as a computer programmer. Like, it's easy to explain, learn these things, get a job that, exercises your JavaScript and Python until you can get a better job with more pay. And so this is how it works. But there's not, in music, there are these levels where just like, I either get lucky or I don't. And most of the people who got lucky are good, but many of the people who don't get lucky are also good or just as good. I mean, I spend a lot of time listening to bands that don't have very many streams or followers and are clearly like as talented musicians, and their music is just as accessible, and there's no reason why they wouldn't be famous too, except that there's 20 million of them and they can't all be famous. So someone wins, but not because
it's a math problem again, right?
It's a math problem, but it's a culture problem. Like, there, how many favorite artists does the world of listeners support? And would it really work? There's a shared experience aspect. So it probably doesn't work to say, well, just split them all up. All right. There's 500 million people on Spotify. There's 20 million artists. So fine. Each artist is going to get 25 fans. And you're assigned, here's the artist you're assigned, and you should listen to only them. That wouldn't be interesting because you'd never be able to talk to anybody about music. So, part of the reason that Taylor Swift is giant is that she's good. And part of the reason is that it gives you, it's a thing to collect around. It's an experience of a good musician that you can share. So for a lot of people, you could show them another musician who's just as good at Taylor as Taylor, but if there's no one to talk to about it, and their shows are not going to be filled with screaming fans or played in a city where you live, then it's not the same. Like, it's not interchangeable. It's not like a sandwich.
Yeah. Well, before I let you guys go, I do have one more question for you, Glenn, and that is, you made this transition from film to what you do now, what would you say to young people who want to get into what you're doing, and how would you go about doing it now if you were sort of trying to make this a career?
So just to be clear, I never had a career. I never was. That's not true. I was once paid a little. I was paid a little bit to take photographs, like in college. But basically, I graduated college and got a job answering the phone at tech support for spreadsheets at Lotus, and a software career developed
Lotus, yeah.
from that. Yeah, Lotus 123. That was my first
Lotus
job.
123.
But my standard advice for all of this is just do something that you care about. And that's not quite the same as like follow your passion, because I think there can be things that are not your passion, but you care about them. But the point is, if you care about whether something is good or not, then you will force yourself to learn whatever you need to learn to make it good. And if you don't care whether it's good or not, then you'll just stop. Like if you try to learn programming from a book, from exercises, you'll do the exercise and it'll be done. And like, okay, that's the end of it. But if you're trying to like make the new release list good, then you do it and it's not good, and you're like, well, damn it, that's not good enough. Like, I care about this. I want it to be better. It's missing this metal band. So then you go and you find out, all right, what was the variable I'm looking at? Why did that metal band not have it? What variables, where would they have gotten more data? How can I incorporate that? And you keep doing it until it's good. So like you said earlier, like I was a self-taught programmer, and I was self-taught in line number basic and in the mid 80s, which was useless, but it's, once you learn programming concepts and then you have things that you want to accomplish, then you have a reason to learn new languages and new tools and whatever it is. I spent most of my time at Spotify writing SQL queries, which was penance for me, because my job before that, I spent 4 years designing a query language that was an alternative to SQL, so that people would never have to suffer from this bureaucratic way to think about data in flat rows, which is what SQL is. And for my hubris in trying to elevate humanity's understanding of data above the flat model, I was then consigned to spend 10 years writing SQL queries. but I wanted to get the data, and so I had to learn the techniques for doing it. I had to learn how to make queries perform faster if I wanted to do things for every artist, for every track, for every user. Then I had to learn stuff. So that's my advice. Do something you care about, because that's the only way. That's the only way for you that you'll learn stuff, but that's the only way for the rest of us that everything will be good. Same thing that we said at the beginning. Like, this is the reason to do your job with love, is because you want everybody else to do their jobs with love, so that your life doesn't suck.
And on that note, John, any sort of parting words?
And it was at least 15 different topics related to Every Noise. And yeah, but I think the way that we ended it was actually perfect. We could do a sequel on this. Glenn, it's more kind of like just understanding your legacy and how it works. I mean, everything that I did at Spotify is still there, right? So I'm very proud of that. Like, all the playlists I created, they're still live. They're still being updated. They're still, some of my intelligence or whatever I brought to it is still there. It's undeniable, Glenn, that the engines that you were will continue on in there. I'm curious as to what you will do with that, how that will educate what you do next. I'm really excited to hear about what you have coming and how you're going to think about music, and how you're going to share what you're thinking about how you're thinking about music with us and the people that are getting a chance to see this, and you talk a little bit about your experience there. I'm always interested in how your work has educated how you should understand Spotify now, even with, it not necessarily being updated. I guess the question is, can Every Noise continue on its own without feeding off of that? And if that's not possible, or if there are people that have the ability to do that internally. And that's one part of the question. The second part of the question, and again, this is probably a sequel conversation, is you know I know how embedded all the stuff that you guys worked on at Echo Nest, and eventually as it became sort of the DNA flat ground of whatever Spotify is building, it feels everything is built on top of it. So I've always felt like understanding the language of what you speak and love that you have for it is one of the reasons why I love Spotify as a platform, as a user, why I loved working there, and why I loved the ability to actually provide context and framework and the ability for people to discover music. As much as I loved music on my own, I loved the ability to be able to help other people discover it. So we have a lot to be thankful for with you, Glenn. I appreciate you taking the time here. So I had tons more, but we just don't have the time.
On behalf of the community, Glenn, thank you for everything, and I mean that sincerely. I mean, you know, there are people who were sort of participating and taking advantage of your work, and shout out to Athena, by the way. Doug Ford was completely in the record about how Fresh Finds came about, and she was definitely a lead person there. Um, but yeah, I hope you can look out over the internet and see all this love coming back to you, and that your commitment and your love to your job and to your work. And I know it's not ending. I just, it's a beautiful thing. And I think even if we never met you or didn't know you, we would know the love and the commitment and the beauty that went into it. Um, and so, on behalf of the community, thank you for everything. And um, if you guys want to share how people can get in touch with you, now would be a good time. And if you don't want, and if you want people to stay away, that's cool too.
Well, everynoise.com is going to stay up. It can't keep updating in exactly its current form without me being at Spotify. So, but we'll see if I figure out some other thing to do with it. If nothing else, there's a lot of music in the world, and there's more of it than you can listen to in the rest of your life. And so even if you just listen to the stuff that we already managed to categorize and try to organize in 10 years of working on it, there's plenty of stuff there. I don't know yet what else I'll do there or otherwise, but I wrote a book explaining why I think that streaming is good for music and music streaming is good for humanity. And as long as not too much cosmic weirdness happens in the next 6 months or so, it should be out in June. So you'll have that to look forward to if you like hearing from me. And I have a blog at furia.com, which is my personal site. And I write about things, sometimes music, sometimes other things. So you can find me.
Cool. John?
I'm searchable on LinkedIn. It's pretty much, I'm a LinkedIn person. I didn't realize that I was, but I very much am. So
yeah, I can.
And I write occasionally on things. Unfortunately, unlike Glenn figured out like, oh, writing about this would be a good idea. I just have not been able to figure out a way to sort of.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the both of you, and looking forward to seeing what's next. And I'm going to hit stop now. Bye-bye.